I'm delighted now to welcome Dr. Steve Barry talking to us about improvising the future. Take it away, Steve.
Thanks, Nicole. Well, speaking of improvising, Don, that was great, and you might have stolen my thunder, but hopefully I can offer some other alternate takes as well on the sort of idea of improvising as we navigate this crazy precarious time. So yeah, thanks so much, everyone. Really just fascinating and inspiring to hear all the conversations tonight. And I'd just like to acknowledge I'm here on Gadigal land here in Sydney and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So today I would like to talk about something that's really close to my heart as a practitioner, as a performer, composer, improviser, as a teacher. And it's this idea of improvising the future. And this question of, I'm sure that we've all been asking quite a lot over the last couple of years, which is, are we doing everything we can to prepare our students for the world? And as the world's getting more complex and these changes that we're facing are accelerating, how do we recognise this landscape in the way that we frame teaching and learning? So what are the values and practices that are underpinning how we're delivering jazz education? What are the mythologies that maybe we've carried on from the past? And do we need to reframe those in some way? And I'd argue that, in fact, it's taking this lens of the meta skills, so not just valuing the music for its cultural and for its creative benefits, but also really tapping into these cognitive and emotional and connectivity and community-driven benefits that come from pursuing this improvisatory craft making as well. And I'm going to talk a little bit tonight about the research that's touching on that as well. And really the aim of that is to question this idea of how are we enhancing the skills and the personal capacities of our students through the pursuit of their craft, and in the same time shaping the vision for them for their potential, whether that's within or, speaking of transferability, whether that's outside of the arts as well, but essentially empowering them to see the multiple potentialities of their skills. So to me, this is really, I love this question of what's the game out of? So if it's a score out of 10 and we're scoring 9, we're doing really well. But if it's a game out of 20 and we're scoring 9, then we're not really passing. So to me, then the question is, well, what is the game out of? And I love this metaphor of the false peak. So I'm an avid runner and I'm very familiar with this idea. When you get to the top of a hill, it looks like it's the top of the hill, but it turns out it's actually not the top of the hill, and there's a lot further to go. And to me, this is somewhat metaphorical and connected to this idea of meta skills. So at the moment, the skills that I'm about to talk about that research is sort of demonstrating are really only taught implicitly through the study of the art form. So there's not necessarily any core curriculum components that are tailored towards fostering and deepening or even helping students become aware of these skills that they're gaining implicitly through the pursuit of their craft. And as a result of that, they're also somewhat under-articulated and under-championed as well. So these are our superpowers as improvisers, and I'd argue that we stand to capture them and really harness them a lot more powerfully. One of the other challenges that we face is this notion of improvisatory art making. So one of the great things about being an improviser and a teacher of improvisation is we can bring that spirit into how we deliver classroom teaching as well. So that can be a really great thing. It allows us to be really responsive to the needs of an individual student. But also it can be challenging in the sense that if everyone has their own unique perspective on craft, everyone has their own individual aesthetics. So then what drives the notion of best practice? How do we identify that? How do we provide resources that offer kind of generalized perspectives on creativity and strategic planning, as a musician, project planning, goal setting, et cetera, et cetera. How do we incorporate those actively as educators as well and help students really, I think someone mentioned earlier the idea of project planning. And I think this is particularly relevant to us as self-managers and as entrepreneurs, essentially, as creative artists. So what are these skills? Well, I've taken the World Economic Forum's Future of Jobs report just as a way to frame and compare and contrast some of the research that's been done recently on jazz improvisation. And one of the things that really stands out, this first quote here is from a study done here by Christopher Cody and Michael Webb at the University of Sydney looking at methodologies and PhD candidates. And one of the things that really shines through here is this idea of experimentation, that, Nick, I think you were touching on earlier, and really trying out things. So testing presuppositions, taking the things that we really like about them, and maybe taking the things that we don't like about them and identifying how we can incorporate those. And it's also very similar to this idea of practice-based research, which has obviously become very encoded in the institution as a research pathway in the last few decades, and this idea of iterative cycles identified by Smith and Dean. And also one of the things we work with as practitioners is when we're dealing with a really complex system, like deciding our own creative aesthetic, which is what a lot of jazz musicians end up having to do. Basically, we just have to kind of nudge the system a little bit and test the things that we like and identify the things that we don't like, as I'm saying, and just see how the system responds and then make iterations based on that. And the second thing is it turns out that the idea of just active learning and self-management is really core to this ethos as well. So the idea of taking ideas from your teachers and developing them, really critically thinking about actually down to the practice level, the notes that you're practicing and how you practice them. So for example, if I really enjoy the music of, say, Chick Corea, a very famous jazz pianist, then I might choose to practice certain melodic ideas, pentatonic scales, for example, that are seeking to emblematic or to replicate that kind of style and find a way to twist them into my own aesthetic. And as a part of that, there's also this really strong sense of identity and storytelling that comes from that. So we take agency very much over our own curriculum development. And a product of that is this sort of sense making and just deciding on what kind of musicians we want to be, what kinds of melodic structures, what kinds of harmony, what kind of, within the sort of broad breadth of styles that the word jazz encompasses, where do we fit and how do we make sense of that when there's so much information and so many different styles of music? How do we navigate those questions? And this will come as no surprise too, but obviously the idea of just creativity, originality, and initiative. But it turns out that this actually plays out in the neuroscience as well. So improvising musicians actually demonstrate higher activity and connectivity in brain areas that are associated with domain general creativity. And also they show this sort of higher ideational creativity as measured by divergent thinking tasks as well. And this plays out also in non-musical forms of improvisation as well. So children that take part in, say, dance and verbal improvisation interventions actually demonstrate the same improvements in divergent thinking and creativity as well. And I think this is also a product of just the nature of the art form in itself. So on the bandstand, we're always dealing with the unexpected. We're always faced with someone plays something that we weren't expecting, and the direction that we thought the performance was going to head, we have to sort of let go of that expectation or of that notion, and offer something in return to the offering that we've just been given. And I think, as Dom, you were touching on, the implications of this for COVID times are quite stark in the sense that we really do need to be improvising quite agilely our responses to a lot of the stresses that we're facing. And it turns out this actually has, furthering the sort of neurological or neuroscience perspective, it plays out in that sense as well. So this was a really interesting study looking at responses to unexpected events between jazz musicians, classical musicians, and non-musicians. And it turns out that jazz musicians had this sort of quite a significant stronger reaction to the unexpected event in the first place, but they also reset to baseline faster. So again, the implication of this in the art form is that we are constantly being handed unexpected things, and we have to find a way to offer this kind of yes and response. And I think this is also in parallel to the kind of fluency of improvisation in life that we're being challenged to rise to the occasion of at the moment. And finally, emotional intelligence. So obviously, as a performer, as an improviser, when we're in this sort of yes and scenario, we really have to be finding ways to respond in ways that build up our colleagues as well in the moment. So even if we're presented with something that perhaps we weren't expecting or even that we didn't like, we have to find some way to transform that into a mutually beneficial experience in the ensemble as well. And sometimes this even comes down to the interface between ensemble and audience as well, not just within the ensemble.
10 minutes.
This is a great quote by Lou Donaldson, the saxophone player here, talking about how sometimes even in the course of an evening's performance, actually the repertoire that you might present may change depending on the reaction of the audience. And this is quite a common thing in, say, standards gigs, and is often, I suppose it's also linked to the gospel tradition as well. So how does this work in practice? Well, so I run the jazz piano elective class here at the University of Sydney, and one of the main ways we sort of try and incorporate this is through the assessment process. So at the end of semester, we have a 60% summative assessment that forms the main part of the course. And the key thing here is that students need to play the repertoire that we've looked at throughout the semester, but they also need to offer creative interpretations of it. Each piece has multiple different tasks, and every week the students get to decide what they perform and the order that they perform those pieces in and those tasks in. So we're trying to foster this ownership and agency over the rate at which the students complete those tasks. Why do we do this? Well, we have a really wide range of previous experience and ability with piano. So we have classical musicians that are really proficient pianists, but we also have people that have some jazz experience but have very little experience with the piano as well. And again, really trying to foster this sense of agency and self-management that I was talking about earlier. And also, I'm really focused on the ethos of experimentation and ownership, and really finding other ways to essentially bring their own musical personalities and tastes to the class. So I've had classical musicians that have played standards in a sort of Russian piano style, and really encouraging that and not imposing my own stylistic tastes or inclinations or what might in other cases been seen as what was stylistically correct in the effort of tapping into this sort of small c creativity as well. And this is just, I won't play these videos here because I'm just a little bit short on time, but this is one way that I structure that exercise. So each task, this is just an accompaniment task, so right-hand chords, left-hand bass. And that particular task has 5 different levels of difficulty. And again, the students get to decide, to which level they pursue this. And it's structured in a way that with increasing difficulty, there's also increasing option for open-endedness too. But at the same time, the students do get to sort of mix and match. So they may play with a improvised accompaniment in the right hand, but play the chords in root position, for example. So it's really challenging them to find other ways and other ways to question the way in which the content is presented to them and go through that sense-making process for themselves. And it turns out that they actually really love this, by and large. They really like the open-endedness of the assessment process. They like that they can choose the rate at which they perform the pieces. And again, when we're asking people to improvise, especially when it might be a relatively new thing for some people, setting that environment where they can actually relax and really settle in to exploring that and realizing that there's no correct answer, there's an emphasis on accuracy, but really trying to foster this sense of exploration. One other thing I really like to do with my jazz students is identify ways to just set goals and really stay oriented towards this sense-making and developing our own aesthetic. And I'll just zoom through this relatively quickly, but this is
1 minute left.
Called the 6 practice zones. And this is just a way of shaping a practice routine that's a little bit based on a book by Gerald Klickstein, which is excellent, called The Musician's Way. He proposes 5, but I like 6 because you can split 2 hours into 6 20-minute sessions then, and you can take each 20-minute session and split that in half, and so you can have 2 perspectives on the same exercise. Really useful way just to frame deliberate practice. But going forward, I think really the question is, well, so what do we do with these meta skills? And I'd argue that we really need to take this view of reframing the story a little bit as well. So at the moment, that story is we train jazz musicians for an industry of live performance, which is excellent, very, very necessary. but also in an environment where the landscape is changing so often, I think it's really important that we perhaps start to reframe that story and tell that as being just as much about training strategic innovators to thrive in this ever-changing world. So really tapping into those ideas of creativity and resilience that I discussed earlier. And obviously some ways to do that people have already discussed, really making sure that we foster this transdisciplinarity in the way that we structure curriculum, but also promote jazz programs as being this pioneering sandbox environment even for creative and innovative thinking. And hopefully ultimately that allows musicians to both supercharge their perspective of their own skills and deepen their craft at the same time. But potentially also it allows us a way to talk about improvised music and jazz music, not only for its creative and its cultural benefits, but also for its ability to foster cognitive development and resilience and creativity as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Steve. Wonderful. Lots of wonderful ideas in there. And while people are thinking of their questions, I've got a question for you.
Sure.
Thinking about the sandbox idea, which is fantastic. How do you think these concepts work within the sort of time-bound constraints of a semester, which doesn't necessarily fit a young artist's sort of blossoming trajectory, and also just the limitations of assessment when we really want to create a genuinely open and exploratory space for all this wonderful learning that you're setting up for the students?
Well, I might answer the second part first. So I think one of the challenges that's come up actually in the process of setting this open-ended assessment is often students do struggle with that too, because the idea that they have that agency can be daunting to some students. So in some cases, actually, that means I do have to improvise a little bit more and maybe reduce the open-endedness for a particular student. So it does then, especially if you're in a lab class, as that class is delivered to 12 to 15 students, it means you have to still take this lens of the principal study a little bit as well. So really making that time to have the sort of one-on-one check-ins with each student. So you're developing that background on that student's history and how they feel about this notion of improvising in the first place. And a lot of them, or for some of them at least, it's just too daunting to improvise. So they just prefer to stick to something that's more concrete, and that's fine too. So I don't want to set an environment that makes people uncomfortable in that sense either. And sorry, what was the first part again?
Oh, just also time frame. I mean, I just really feel like for so many students, there's so much pressure with the sort of the 12-week kind of mentality. And I'm often telling them, hey, if it's not fully cooked in 12 weeks, your life is not over.
Yeah.
And with the sort of, the meta skills and competencies that you're talking about, people are going to have their own time frame for the way in which they develop those.
Yeah.
I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, no doubt. Well, I think even just the fact of having the conversation in the first place and framing the education in a way that also just presents that to students, because I think some of them even don't consider that as being transferable skills or as being a creative skill set that you could apply potentially in other spheres as well. But you're right in the sense that there's only so much you can do in a semester when you're trying to help a student learn the repertoire that they have to learn for the semester or overcome technical challenges that they're facing. And some students do respond better to the scaffolding than others, so it is really a dynamic situation there.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you, Kirsten. Have we got a very quick question?
Yeah, I just was wondering how you found, so you mentioned that you had some piano majors, but you also have people who didn't play piano much, and if they had another primary instrument, if they talked to you at all about and the transference of skills to their primary instrument?
In some cases, yes. I taught a semester of a jazz piano for classical pianists class, which was particularly interesting because many of them came in having fairly minimal experience with improvising, but also quickly realised that they could do it, and that sort of door opened to them. So seeing that happen was really interesting too. And I think some of them, it was even just a case of then giving them the permission to apply that to their craft more broadly too. And I think that's one of the main challenges too, is just presenting it in a way that makes it accessible.